going to jump right in today. You know, people say all the time, well, what do you talk about on Easter? Some say talk about the resurrection. Others people say, we'll start a new message series, which we're going to do next week. Some say, you know, make it light. Some people say, make it heavy. Some people only come this time, so you only got one shot. You know, for me, I kept coming back to one message. It's the message that Paul told the church in Corinth when he said, the only thing that matters is this, that Jesus Christ came, that he died, that he was buried, and on the third day, he rose again. Paul said, that's it. Nothing else matters. If I have a message, if I have something I want to proclaim this morning, he said it's this. It is the death, the burial, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if we have one story to tell here today, I want it to be his story. I'm jumping out in faith and doing something I did several months ago, but I want you to hear the story of Easter from one of those who were closest to it. I want you to hear the story of Easter from a guy who was a follower and wondered maybe at times what it would be like to have lived back then and to live the Easter story through one of his closest friends. You may know him as the disciple Peter. I've heard they might kill me tomorrow. Scared? A little. A lot, really. Nervous, anxious. Anxious maybe is the right word because I want to see him again and I'm so ready. In many ways it seems like 100 years ago, but in some ways it seems just like yesterday. Did I know Jesus? The whole town knew about Jesus. In fact, I might say the whole countryside knew about Jesus. I was a fisherman. I was tired of the Roman occupation of our country, so I joined a group called the Zealots. I mean, we were known for hating the Romans, and I was going to join in this new movement. I was hot-headed, so you know, I fit right in. I really never made the cut for rabbi school, so the Zealots were the perfect choice for me. But I remember the day Jesus called me. I mean, I've been fishing with my brother Andrew. We had cast out our nets one more time when from the shore I heard a voice that said, Simon, Andrew, follow me. It was Jesus. I mean, I knew a little about Jesus because the whole town was abuzz about this man. And to think a rabbi, and might I say an up-and-coming rabbi who was making some waves, wanted me to be one of his followers. So Andrew and I both said, yes, yes. I mean, it was every little Jewish boy's dream. So when we followed this carpenter turned to Messiah, we were going to be revolutionaries. Revolutionaries in this movement to overthrow Rome, to cast them out and restore our country to the glory it had during the days of King David and King Solomon. One of the first things he did was change my name. He said, Simon, we're going to call you Peter. Oh, I was good with that because Peter meant rock. Peter meant solid. Peter meant firm. You know, it's funny. Jesus saw things in me that I never really saw in myself. And Jesus had this uncanny ability to look past who I was and to see who I could be. And his stories, and his miracles. No one taught like Jesus taught. And no one was doing the things Jesus was doing. Well, I remember the very first miracle that he did. It was at a wedding. Weddings were big in our days. They had lots of music and they had lots of wine. And in fact, it was considered a smack in the face to run out of wine. Unthinkable. But at this wedding, the unthinkable happened and they ran out of wine. Mary, his mother, when she realized what had happened, she came to Jesus and told him, and Jesus looks and says like, Mom, but Mary knew something about her boy. She knew that her son could save this situation. So she goes and she tells the servants, she says, whatever he asks you to do, whatever he says to you, you do it. And he had a big ask. Because what he asked him to do was this. He said, the pots that you normally serve water out of, he said, go fill it with water and then come back and serve it to your guest. We watched. We watched as they went out. We watched as they came in. And we watched as they began to pour. And our hearts stopped. Because out of the water pot came wine. And not just any wine. It was the best wine we had tasted. And the crowds, more like a mob, I should say. They lined the streets. They were coming to him from everywhere. Heal me, Jesus. Touch me, Jesus. They came through the rooftops. They leaped through crowds just to touch the edge of his clothes. He was like a rock star. And then there was a time he fed all of those people. 5,000 men alone, not counting the women and all of those kids. And although nobody counted, maybe 20,000 people there that day. He had been teaching all day long as was normal. And at the end of the day, we came up to him and we said, Jesus, would you just kind of dismiss the crowd because we're hungry? They're hungry too. Jesus looked to us and said, you feed them. How in the world were we to feed them? We didn't have what we needed. We didn't have money, and we certainly didn't have a plan. And Andrew, my little brother, and how embarrassing. He finds this little boy who hasn't eaten his lunch and brings the little boy to Jesus and says, here's a little, but what is it among so many? I thought, Andrew. But Jesus took that little boy's lunch and he blessed it. And then he began to hand it out to us. And he said, now you hand it out to them. And it kept going and it kept going. And first there was 500 and then 1,000 and then 2,000 and then 3,000 and then 10,000, 20,000 people. It was the lunch they kept giving, and then there were leftovers. And there was the time when Moses and Elijah were there and they appeared and we heard them. And there was the time that he raised the little girl and gave her back to his dad. There was the time that he healed somebody and he wasn't even in the town where the person was. And then there was Lazarus. He raised him from the dead. Blind people were seeing, lame people were walking. People were coming to him from everywhere. And he was touching lepers, unclean. It was as if he was saying to them, God loves you and he hears you and he sees your cry. He was touching people no one else would dare to touch, and hugging people no one else would dare to hug. And that last week, if you had told me that last week that he would be dead by Friday, I would have laughed. We all would have laughed. He rode a donkey into the city, and the crowds, you should have seen them. They were taking off their clothes and they were throwing their coats on the ground in front of the donkey. Others were climbing the trees throughout the city of Jerusalem, and they were cutting the palm branches down. Some of them were waving them over him as he rode by. Others were making a sea of green palm for his donkey to ride on. It's funny how things change, though. He told us he was going to die. Several times. How did we miss it? It was so far from what we are experiencing. How could the one who could make the blind see die? How could the one who could make people who couldn't walk now walk? There was no way we could tell what was going on. And tell me this, how could the one who could raise the dead die himself? It was too much for us. Thomas, we called him Doubting Thomas later on. Thomas finally looked at Jesus right before he went into Jerusalem. He said, well, let's just go and die with you if that's what it takes. Jesus. We knew something was happening on Thursday. He had given such secretive instructions, and here we were taking the Passover in a room where no one knew. And Jesus, he looked at us. And he said, one of you will betray me tonight. We were sad. We were confused. And we began to ask, even Judas looked at Jesus and said, is it I? Judas leaves, and there we were. Jesus looked at the rest of us and said, and all of you will leave me tonight, will forsake me. I looked back at Jesus and I said, all of them may leave you. John may run and Thomas may run, but I will not run. In fact, I am willing to die for you tonight if that's what it takes, Jesus. And I meant it. I meant it. I was ready to die for him. But I found out that often it's easier to die for something than it is to live for something. We left that room. We made our way out the city, over a brook and into a garden. The words that Jesus had said just minutes before, Peter, This night won't end before you've denied me 3 times. They just kept echoing in my mind. Jesus goes into the garden. He leaves he leaves 8 of us, and then he goes a little bit more, and he leaves 3 of us. And then he goes about as far as you could throw a rock, and he kneels down and prays. And while Jesus prayed, I slept. We all slept. It wasn't long before we felt his hand. We heard him speaking, and he said, wake up, the hour has come. And we were like, what are you talking about? But then we knew there were hundreds of people. I mean, literally Romans everywhere, Jewish people, Roman people, they were all around. And then there was a look, there was a kiss, and then Jesus. I mean, out of nowhere, he walks right in front of them and says, who do you seek? I mean, it was as if he was walking right into their plans. It was as if he was giving himself over to them. I couldn't take it. I had a sword and I took it out and I cut someone. Let me tell you, I cut someone that night. That's what I did. But he picked up their ear and put it back on. And I think in a moment we realized he's going to let them take him. The guy who had done all of the stuff, he's going to go willingly. Well, we ran. Every one of us ran that night. It was a little while later. I was standing outside wondering what had happened. I mean, they arrested him. They put him in chains and they led him away, and he's in a house. And I was standing by a fire outside. And all of a sudden, a girl approached me. I mean, she was just a servant girl, and she said, hey, you know him, don't you? And I looked at her and said, I don't know him. I don't know who it is. I'm just here by the fire. A little while later, someone else approached, and they said it again. They said, I think, aren't you one of his? And I said, no, I'm not one of his. I mean, look at all the people in Jerusalem. There are 100,000 people in this city this weekend. I don't know. I'm just a visitor like anyone else. And then someone else spoke up and said, I know you are with him. I saw you in the garden. Even your speech betrays you. And I looked back and I said, I told you, I have no idea who he is. And I began to curse and I began to swear. And as my words echoed down those alleyways, they brought him out. He didn't see me at first, but I saw him. His face was bruised and bloody. Spit was running down his cheek. They pushed him. And at the moment they pushed him, our eyes met. And I remembered his words. Peter, this night won't end before you've denied me 3 times. Some rock I was that night. They killed him, crucified him. Such a short word for such a horrible thing. John stayed with him. Some of the women were there. His mom, Mary Magdalene, but not me. Later that night, John had told me that one of the things he said on the cross was, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I thought, Father, forgive them? I mean, how do you forgive something like that? How do you get past something like that? How do you look past that kind of stuff? And maybe he could forgive John, but no way he could forgive me. No way. It was somewhere around noon, and the sky went black. I'm just going to tell you, the sun quit shining, and it was like every light in heaven just disappeared. We thought, I mean, even in the darkness, those of us who were standing back, we looked and we thought, surely he can save himself. I mean, he saved others, and that's exactly what they were saying and yelling to him. It would be later on before we realized that he could have saved himself. And he could have saved us. He just couldn't do both. So he chose. And at 3 o'clock on that Friday afternoon, our world ended. Our world stopped. With one last push, Jesus lifted his legs, And with a loud voice, he cried out, Father, Father, into your hands I give you my spirit. And his legs collapsed and his head dropped. And it was over. It was over. People screamed, earthquakes, the sun, amazing, the sun returned. And they tell me that the veil in the temple that had stood for hundreds, thousands of years, 40 feet high, was ripped from the top to the bottom as if God himself had looked down and said, there is nothing between us now because of what just happened on the hill outside your city. Joseph, who had been a follower, had some money, and he came and he asked Pilate, could we have his body? Pilate looked and said, let's make sure that he's dead. They sent for the Roman centurion. The Roman centurion came in, confirmed that Jesus was dead. So Pilate said, hey, you can have his body. Pilate and Nicodemus and some of the women and John, they took his body down and they laid him in a tomb that belonged to Joseph. Nicodemus had some spices and some myrrh, and he took some linen and they wrapped his body, and then they wrapped his head, and then they laid him in the tomb, and then they rolled the stone in front of it. No one slept that night. We wondered if we were next. We kept the doors locked. We were scared, and within each of our hearts was this overwhelming feeling of how could we have been so wrong? How could we have missed it? How could the one we thought was the Son of God die? Friday came and went. The Sabbath seemed like a blur. The women were making some spices because they had decided that they were going to go on Sunday morning and anoint his body properly. And on Sunday morning they did. We stayed in the house, locked behind doors, but they got out. They made their way to the tomb in the dark to give him the burial that he deserved. A little time passed. We were in the house when all of a sudden at the door, we just hear banging. We open the door and there's the women. 5, 6, they just come in the house, and their words seem so confusing, and it's just blurbs, it's just sentences, and they start saying things like, when we got to the tomb, the stone was rolled away, his body wasn't there. There were these men, they glowed like lightning, and they said, why are you looking for living things among dead things? Don't you realize he is alive, just like he told you he would be? But we couldn't believe it. I mean, we knew they were grief-stricken. We didn't know what had happened, but we heard their words like idle tales. It was then I looked at Mary Magdalene and I said, Mary, what in the world are you talking about? And she said, Peter, do you not understand? They have taken his body, they have stolen him, and we don't know where they put him. I looked to John. John looked back at me, and we got up and we made a mad dash out of that room. John beat me and got there first. He was standing looking in, but when I got there, I ran right in behind him. And there I stood at the place where his body had been. The linen cloths were still there. The covering that was over his head was still there, but he wasn't there. It was just like he had disappeared into thin air. John and I were wondering what in the world had happened. As we walked home, John said, I believe something miraculous has happened, but I didn't know what to believe. It was a little bit later that day that Jesus actually appeared to Mary. She had come back. She had followed John and I to the tomb that morning. And when we left her, she was at the entrance to the tomb crying. Somewhere that morning, someone comes up behind her and says, lady, why are you crying? She thinks the guy she's talking to is the gardener, the keeper of the cemetery. And she turns and she says, they have taken away the body of my Lord, and I don't know what they have done with him. And her eyes, she's grief-stricken, and she doesn't even recognize who it is until he calls her name. And in the middle of a cemetery, on the worst weekend they could have imagined, Mary heard her name called by Jesus. Mary. And she leapt like she had never jumped up before. And she goes and she hugs him and she can't let go. And she cries out, Master, Lord, Rabbi, Teacher. And he looks back at her and he says, Mary, I got something for you to do. Would you go to the city and would you tell the disciples that you have seen me? And Mary, she takes off running, holding up that dress that she's got on, and she is going as fast as she can, and she gets to where we're locked behind doors, and she is banging on the door. We open the door for her, and she falls in, and she says 5 of the most beautiful words in history. I have seen the Lord. I have seen him. And all of a sudden, later that night, he appears to us. We were questioning her, talking with her, looking for him. And then all of a sudden, when we didn't think he could be found, he appears in the room where we are, and he says, peace. And when he says peace, he gives us something to eat. He says, don't be afraid, because we were afraid. And we ate with him, and we talked with him. Only one there was at Thomas, and 7 days later, he would appear to Thomas, because Thomas had said, you know what, unless I see his scars, I can't believe. And Jesus walked right up to Thomas and said, put your hand in my side, Thomas, and feel my hands. But whatever you do, don't leave this room doubting. And then he appeared. He appeared to 500 over here, and 100 over here, and 200 over here. And he appeared to this family and that person and those people over there walking. And all of a sudden, the whole city was once again talking about him. And what we had thought was the end was only the beginning. And all of his stories, they took on new meaning, and they took on new purpose. And when we finally realized that story about him feeding the 5,000, that miracle that he had done, we thought it was just another good thing. What he was telling us was this: I'm going to send you into a world that hates me, and I'm going to send you into a world that's going to crucify me. But let me tell you, there are going to come times when you think you can't do it, when you can't handle what's going on, and when you begin to give up. I want you to remember these fish. And I want you to remember that with me, a little bit is a lot. And you may not have what it takes, but it was never about that. It was about giving me what you had, and he could turn a little into a lot. And that water to wine thing, maybe his first miracle was actually his last. The miracle, it wasn't about water, and it wasn't about wine. The miracle was about his ability, his power to change ordinary people into courageous, extraordinary people. The power to call us by the name that he saw us by and make us into what we needed to be. And thousands of people became followers, and cowards became courageous, and fishermen became preachers, and a group of ragtag disciples changed the world, not because of a death, but because of a resurrection. That Sunday morning was the turning point. They tried to explain it away, but they couldn't. They tried to say, well, the Romans stole his body. Let me tell you, when people by the thousands started turning to Jesus, if the Romans had stolen his body, they would have brought it forth. They would have produced it. They would have stopped once and for all the thing they had already tried to stop. And then they said, we stole his body. Oh yeah, that's right. We stole his body. We who ran, we who denied, we who got scared at a servant girl now are going to give our lives and die the most horrible deaths for something we know not to be true. None of what they came up with was true. And nothing made sense except the truth that God had sent his son into the world, and that he lived for us, and that they killed him. They put him in a tomb, and 3 days later, God called him out, and Jesus walked out of a grave. It was the only thing that made sense that day. And we saw him, and we ate with him, and we talked with him. And when he told us to go into all the world and tell this most amazing story about a king who had come and given his life for his people, we believed it could be done. Maybe tomorrow will be my last day here. Oh, but I'm so ready. I wasn't ready years ago, but I was ready now. And let me tell you, I wanted to see him again. And I knew what was waiting just on the other side, because I had learned to live for the one. And now maybe I'll die for him. But they're not taking me out, let me tell you. They're just taking me home. And this time I won't run, and I will not deny. And I will keep every promise, for I, like Mary and Peter and Matthew and Thomas and hundreds of others, have seen him alive, and there is no going back when you see him alive again. I got to go. But one last thing I want to leave with you. Don't give up. Don't give up. If you begin to think you don't have what it takes, you remember those fish. You remember that he can do a lot with your little bit. And when you think that maybe you're not cut out for the job, you remember that maybe in you will find what I found, that his first miracle was his last. And if you follow him long enough, you will look back and realize that he still changes water into wine. Look at what he did to an old Jewish fisherman. I don't know how that hit you. But let me tell you, like all of his friends, Peter would give his life, crucified upside down, they say, for the crime of believing that Jesus was who he said he was. And 2,000 years later, here we are, not because a group of people believed something, but because they saw something that made them believe beyond hope that the impossible was now possible. And they gave their lives for this one message. And it is the message you have sung this morning. And I hope with all my heart that you meant those words. That when you sang, death was arrested, stopped in its tracks, that in your soul you know that. And because of that, that you're free, forever you're free. And when you go out of here, you'll be singing the song of the redeemed. That you know, believing that by your Spirit, God, I will rise from the ashes of defeat, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that because he came out of a grave, you'll come out of a grave. Easter, the event in history that says we are not following Jesus into a tomb. We are following him out of one. Resurrection doesn't just mean that Jesus got up. It means that you'll get up, and you'll get up, and you'll get up. You'll get up, and you'll get up, and you'll get up. And that, my friends, is something to sing and shout about. Ain't no grave gonna hold this body down anymore.